In tonight's reading, Bharati Mukherjee will read first, followed by Clark Blaze. In Bharati Mukherjee's latest novel, entitled Miss New India, she shows us that the India she has studied for many years really is new, and yet remains in many ways familiar. What's new? For one thing, in a world in which a great many people are comfortable with the toys and gadgets and appurtenances of modernity. To be Calcutta-born in the new India will often mean that so far as easy reliance upon cell phones and computers is concerned, one might just as well have been born in Manhattan. If consumerism is, or was, typically associated with Western societies long habituated to modernity, consumerism may now also seem so commonplace in India as to be unremarkable. But these are all about superficial tokens of newness, and there are in Bharati's fiction more significant markers of change. Young women, for example, may aspire to lives and even careers in which they answer the summons to self-actualization in ways that are both moving and some of the time comical. Bharati, we remember, has long been what Margaret Atwood once called an unforgiving observer of everything she has asked us to witness. Unforgiving in what sense? In the sense that she insists we take in the costs and consequences of every advance, and insists, moreover, that for every gain in self-confidence and self-fashioning, there is the possibility of big-time self-deception. As has often been said of Bharati, she never lets anyone off the hook, especially people who are well-intentioned, and she is assiduous to expose even what nice people like ourselves, or, like the natives of faraway places, would prefer to sweep under the proverbial rug. Though Bharati's fiction is not marked by a missionary or polemical fervor, it is animated by the drive to see things clearly and to dispense with the enlightened formulas that so appeal even to the best and brightest among us. It is possible in Bharati's work to feel compassion for those who suffer, for those who strive and fail, for those who are raped or defrauded, for those who, as child brides in the India that still in some places exists, are sold to the highest bidder. But it is also an aspect of Bharati's work to look hard at the difficulties involved in understanding people whose lives are radically different from ours. Often in writing about unfamiliar people in unfamiliar settings, writers will exoticize the trappings and even the customs of the country, the better to suggest that deep down all human beings are, however apparently different, the same. But Bharati does not resort to those exoticizing designs, and she provides an entirely unsentimental portrayal of struggles never fully won or renounced. In many ways, Bharati has always been preoccupied, above all, with the problem of identity. How, she has asked, can people make themselves over when they carry within them so much that is indisputably a part of them, however much they would wish this to be otherwise? How can people who have opened their arms to diversity, to East and West, old and new, traditional and non-traditional, not suffer irreparably from a sort of permanent multiple personality disorder? How do we know, any of us, that in opting for progress and independence from tradition or custom, we have not traded in one form of inauthenticity for another? Bharati was for many years a part of this summer program, and though she has been away from us for far too long, it seems to me perfect that on this final night of our 25th anniversary season, she and Clark Blaze should be here to conclusively mark the occasion. Please welcome Bharati Mukherjee.
Thank you very much. It's just feels like being back home. Thank you. I've always been interested, as Bob said, in questions of identity. And in the last 7 or 8 years, I've been thinking through what it means to be American, what it means to be Indian, etc., in this age of globalization. And this novel got started when I was trying to activate a bank card. And the woman who was processing the activation sounded very much an Indian, but with an overlay of American accent. And I tried to sort of question her, where was she from? And she said, I'm not allowed to tell you. And then it all kind of came spilling out. And she said that in the early days of globalization, this was true anyway, that not only did they have to assume a faux American name and biography, but they also had to give themselves little legend about what small town they were actually from, where they were, they had gone to school, just in case an American customer tried to trip them up, saying, I know you're not American. So when I went to, I go to, all my relatives are in India, and one cousin, a first cousin, lives in Bangalore, which has become the IT hub, one of the main call center cities in India, and there's vast amounts of foreign money coming in because of the outsourcing trade. And I realized that I'm looking at an awful lot of Sister Carries and Becky Sharps, young women with ambition, with the absolute belief that they have an inalienable right to personal happiness, which was a no-no in their parents' generation. And they are not going to go to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, let alone all the IITs for engineers and technical people, but they have ambition, a good phone voice, and enough convent school English to give them a fresh start in life. And so they were leaving their dead-end provincial towns and coming to these go-go IT hubs in which they were without chaperones, without any kind of old-fashioned traditional morality or policing to stop their adventures. It was no longer, Daddy, get me a bridegroom. I'm not even interested in marriage. I'm interested in romance. And if that doesn't happen, then in sex. It was that kind of, personal happiness, which, given the salaries that overseas telephone people earn, they were able to spend on Versace jeans and carry Prada purses, and consumerism, however, to be looked at as a sign of success. I have earned and I will now spend, as opposed to the old-fashioned Indian communal we. My heroine is a 19-year-old Bengali-speaking, mother tongue Bengali like me, who grows up in a backward state called Bihar in India. And she has an expatriate American, former Peace Corps instructor, as her teacher, who gives lower middle class people with ambition conversational English lessons, American English, and so on. And armed with a scholarship from him and her good speaking voice and her knowledge of some minimal training in Chicago accent, Georgia accent, New England accent, she arrives in Bangalore to hopefully become a call center agent and earn a very, very decent living. But that means that she has to, it comes with the imperative that during your work shift, you take on an American voice, name, biography, and so on. This is young Angela Angie in Bangalore on her first day being interviewed by an Anglo-Indian elderly lady who lets out rooms for young women without families looking for jobs. Minnie Badgett waved a gloved hand at the clutter on the dining room table. Stacks of floral patterned gilt-rimmed china dinner plates, salad plates, soup bowls, soup tureens, platters, teacups and saucers, cake stands, butter dishes, red glass goblets furry with dust, a couple of tarnished silver trays, and a few pieces of crockery Anjali couldn't identify. What do you think? Anjali was being interviewed by an imperious octogenarian whose good opinion she needed. She didn't have to like Minnie Badgett, but she did have to humor her if she wanted a cheap, safe roof over her dazed head. "I'm truly speechless, madam. This is a historically important residence, as your former teachers doubtless informed you. In this very room, on these very plates, a very long time ago, His Majesty Edward VII dined, as well as innumerable minor royalty." And they hadn't been washed since, Anjali thought. Minnie's voice was deep, almost masculine, and her accent, so far as Anjali could determine, perfectly British. Unlike earlier generations of Indians, Anjali was too young to have heard a pure English accent or to have experienced icy rectitude of the British character. Minnie briefly smiled, or at least twitched her lips. "If you can call that English." She seemed to be taking in everything Anjali had said, and for some reason was finding it amusing and not quite relevant. "This residence has 10 bedrooms, but only 4 are kept open. We had a retinue of over 100, including drivers, gardeners, cooks, butlers, khidmatgars, chaprasis, bearers, derwans, and jamadars. Now only Ashok, poor boy, is left, and he's worked here for over 70 years. The garage in the back has 20 motor cars. And when I say motor cars, I'm referring to Bentleys and Duesenbergs, not the rattletraps you Indian people drive. My late husband staged darbars for 500 guests, Nizams and Maharajas and the Viceroy, of course. For entertainment, we knocked croquet balls into the hedges and played badminton under torchlight, and the guests arrived on fabulous elephants decked out in silk brocade with gold tusks and wondrously decorated howdahs, making their way in a procession down Oxford Street, which I hope you've noticed is now Badgett Alley, turning in at Kew Gardens and up the porte cochere. There, each dignitary would disembark down decorated ladders, still stored somewhere on the premises. If you doubt me, there are photographs to prove it. Well, she makes the grade and gets in, but is not quite happy in this Anglo-Indian holdover in a city that is becoming more and more globalized and rich. One afternoon, with all 3 of her fellow boarders gone to work, and Minnie Badgett asleep after lunch, and Ashok off to visit the outbuilding squatters, Anjali did some incautious snooping around in the closed but unlocked ballroom, billiards room, conservatory, reception hall, smoking room, and the 3 ground-floor bedroom suites with attached bathrooms and dressing rooms. The ballroom floor tilted at such an upward angle that she had to catch her breath to simply walk across it. The dressing rooms were twice the size of the room in which she and her mother used to sleep. 2 sets of curtains, 1 thick and 1 sheer, hung from a velvet-covered pelmet above each window. Sparrows had nested in the sconces and chandeliers, and no one had removed the twigs and twine. Rats had chewed through the brocade upholstery of settees and gnawed on the heavy wooden chaise longue. Geckos darted up and down cracked statues. Anjali was about to sneak out of the ballroom when a row of photographs along the far wall drew her attention. Unlike the usual commissioned portraits of the vanished officers with their banana skin helmets, these were wide, black and white landscapes, seemingly military scenes, framed in pewter. As she drew closer, she began to feel sick. Sari-clad bodies lay strewn along a riverbank. The faces were young, no older than she was. Bodies of Sikhs, you could identify them with their turbans, lay stacked like firewood, and walking among the bodies were uniformed British soldiers grinning broadly. One had his foot on the head of a dead Sikh, striking the pose of the great white hunter. Maybe he was the young Maxfield Badgett. Anjali hoped he was. If so, all actions and opinions of Maxie and Minnie Badgett were unforgivable, and all transgressions by Badgett House boarders heroic. Another painting featured a distant row of hanged men, Sikhs with their hair chopped off, hanging by their turbans, silhouetted against the setting sun. Badgett House was a museum of horrors. She felt herself swelling with rage, then venom. There had to be a reckoning. She wondered if other boarders over the years had taken the same secret tour, and how many dumps resulted from their quiet acts of deliberate spite. She missed her teacher, the American Peter Champion. He could have explained these photos. Maybe she was the first that Mr. Champion had sent to invade this warehouse, to touch the objects and feel the blunt insult of history. Anjali was tall and icy. Nothing could touch her. If Minnie had been standing at the door, about to invoke Badgett House rules, Anjali would have pushed her down and walked over her bones. She slipped a silver goblet under her sweater. In school, she had never really warmed to history book chapters devoted to India's heroic freedom fighters, and the exalted statues of martyrs to Indian independence had left her cold. There were families in Gauripur, even today, living off the glory of their great-grandparents' arrests and jailings. Now 3 old pictures had driven home an appreciation she'd never felt. I'm Indian, she thought. I'm Indian, and no one can take that away from me. I have no roots elsewhere but in India. My ancestors were hated and persecuted by everyone but themselves. Finally, she had a test for authenticity. Which side of this picture are you on? Is your foot on my head? Are you a hanged fighter? Or were you laughing at the sight of men dangling by their turbans and women's bodies clogging the riverbank? Everyone in my life has tried to change me, make me want something alien, and make me ashamed that I might not be good enough. Why should I want to change my name and my accent? Why should I plead for a chance to be allowed to take calls from people who've spent too much money or driven their cars into a ditch? Anjali sauntered back to her bare cubicle in a better mood. At least now she knew she didn't have to be cowering and grateful. Minnie wasn't just the past. She was that thing that in newspaper column that she had read was described as Chinatown. Minnie was the bones under the building boom. Badgett House was considered a respectable address, a first stop for young working girls. Badgett House carried its own recommendation. Minnie was admired for running a no-nonsense boarding house that was good training for corporate world, but there was nothing admirable about it. Anjali, who'd looked on the British period as a long comic opera, felt a sudden connection to all the Indian dead and the indignities they suffered. She saw her parents still cowering and still recovering from the scars of colonialism, and the dazzling new Bangalore as a city of total amnesia. And it was all a lie. House rules did not apply, not when she dispensed, and they were dispensed by Minnie Badgett to to a young woman like Anjali Bose. Anjali wrapped a silver goblet in a T-shirt and stuffed it inside her Samsonite, a trophy. Thank you very much.
In the multi-volume edition of stories by Clark Blaze, published several years ago by Porcupine's Quill in Canada, you see at once that this writer has operated from a secure sense of place. But this is really very strange, in light of the fact that the individual volumes are assembled under headings like Southern Stories, Pittsburgh Stories, Montreal Stories, and so on. Clark's latest book of short fiction, just published, is called The Meager Tarmac, and sure enough, it is devoted to India and the stories of Indian immigrants in North America. These new stories do shift their settings considerably from Montreal to Pittsburgh to Toronto, but as always, you read on with the sense that place, including the deep impression of Mother India, matters more to this writer than it does to most of his contemporaries. How to account for this? Perhaps a way into the question is provided by the title of one brilliant early volume by Clark called Resident Alien. Say the words, Resident Alien, and you begin to see the paradox at the heart of the vision informing Clark's work. For this has been a writer perpetually in search of what may be called a solid habitation in the world. He knows, to be sure, that there really is such a thing as home. His characters do, some of the time, rely on their secure place in the world to direct their ambitions, but often, especially in the stories and novels told by Clark in the first person, we feel more than a passing current of mistrust. The speaker, who often sounds like a version of Clark himself, is clearly anxious about what one of them calls a means of retrieval. How, he wonders, can he get back what he has lost? Worst yet, how can he be confident there ever was a secure there, as he thinks he remembers it? And isn't it the case that if you really could go back and retrieve whatever it was you had, you wouldn't want it? Not really. This sense of things is inscribed in all of Clark's work, which is informed by what Clark calls memories of unhousement. Listen to this brief passage on Canada, which has been so central to Clark's troubled sense of identity. This Canada, he says, at one point, was more than merely attractive. It was compelling. But in what way exactly did he possess this compelling entity and promise of secure identity? Characteristically, Clark describes himself as a sort of outrider, as follows, quote, "In the various towns of my first 10 years, we had always lived in small apartments carved out of old servants' quarters on the fringes of other people's families, and we always seemed to be sharing some vital function of other people's lives." Note here the reference to various towns, and thus the lack of a single stable location. And note too the fringes of other people's families and other people's lives. No secure foundation here or anywhere else in Clark's fiction. Even where a character really is rooted in a particular place in something resembling an actual family of his own, that family is forever confronted by the prospect of ruin and dispersal and shame and flight. Of course, with a writer like Clark, who has given us such richly varied work, it is always a mistake to rely too much on a single theme or angle of vision to represent the entire vision, but we can say with full confidence that in all of his work there is an extraordinary, rich, continuous agitation of surface and sympathy, and that he has steadily tracked the contradictory patterns of tenderness and betrayal, longing and incompletion, place and no place. This is a writer many of us have very long admired and adored. Clark Blaze.
You wonder why we keep coming back. Thank you, Robert. The stories in The Meager Tarmac are linked, so it's a little bit difficult to extract one, but there is one that stands a little bit alone, and so I'm going to read it. And you don't need to know anything else about the character. It's called Brewing Tea in the Dark. I want to read just the last paragraph of the story that precedes it because it's from the same character and it's his the introduction to him. This is the last sentence, and it'll give you a sense of the entry into the next one. This life, which I understood once in terms of science, the heavy elements, the calcium, phosphorus, iron, and zinc, settled on us from exploded stars, is but one of an infinity of lives. The city, the world, has come and gone an infinite number of times. One day I expect my Nirmala, whatever her name, to come to my door, wherever that door will be. Our eyes will lock, and I will invite her in. Okay, that was the end of that story. Now, the beginning. Brewing Tea in the Dark. My youngest uncle and I and a busload of other English speakers were on a tour of Tuscany, leaving Florence at dawn, then on to Siena, followed by a mountain village, a farm lunch, another mountain village, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and back to Florence after dark. I had planned to spread his ashes unobtrusively over a peaceful patch of sloping land, but each stop seemed more appealing than the one before, and so by lunchtime I was still holding on to the urn. The mountain towns on our morning stops had been seductive. I could imagine myself living in any of them, walking the steep streets and taking my dinners in sidewalk cafes. I could learn Italian, which didn't seem too demanding. The fresh air and Mediterranean diet could add years to my life. The countryside of Tuscany in no way resembles the red soil greenery of Bengal. Florence does not bring Calcutta to mind, except in its jammed sidewalks. My uncle wanted to live his next life as an Italian, or perhaps as some sort of creature in Italy, maybe just as a tall, straight cypress. This is a theological dispute. Life might be eternal, but is human life guaranteed every rebirth? Each time that he and his lady friend, Devi, a painter, returned from Italy to California, he pronounced himself more Italian than ever. A shrewd assessor of fine art and engineering, with a new hat, shoulder bag, jacket, or scarf to prove it. He said Devi was the prism through which the white light of his adoration was splintered into all the colors of the universe. This sounds more natural in Bangla, our language. If that is true, many men are daubed in her colors. She taught him the Tuscan palette, the umbers and siennas. At the farm lunch, a woman of my approximate age, whose gray curls were bound in a kind of ringleted ponytail, sat opposite me at the refectory tables. She was wearing a dark blue University of Firenze sweatshirt over faded blue jeans. In the lissom way she moved and in the way she dressed, she seemed almost childlike. I am 45, but slow and heavy in spirit. She dropped her voice to a whisper. I can't help noticing that urn you're carrying. Is it what I had placed it unobtrusively, I thought, on the table between the wine glasses. It was stoppered and guaranteed airtight, a kind of thermos bottle of ashes. I was afraid that if I put him on the floor, an errant foot might touch him. Very perceptive, I said. It's my uncle. Lovely to meet you, sir, she said to the urn. Then to me, you can call me Rose. Call me Rose? I must have squinted, but she said, you were talking to him back in Siena. You were sitting on a bench and holding it in your lap, and I heard you. Of course, I couldn't understand what you were saying, but I'd never seen anything quite like it. Why the mystery about your name? I asked. You'll find out, she said. Perhaps she changed her name every day or on every trip or for every man she met. I told her my name, Abi, short for Abhishek. The farm landscape reminded me of paintings on the walls of Italian restaurants, mounded vineyards framed by cypress trees against a wall of purple hills sprinkled with distant whitewashed villas. She moved like a dancer to the fence, then turned and called to me, "Why not right here?" I walked over to the fence, but a goat wandered up to us, looking for food, and tried to butt me through the slats. Then he launched a flurry of shiny black pellets. "Maybe not," she said. When we remounted the tour bus, the aisle seat next to me turned up vacant. "May I?" she asked. She told me that my morning seatmate had also made a connection with the urn and a possible bomb or a shortwave radio. He too had seen me talking in a strange language in Siena, probably Arabic. During the next leg of the trip, she opened up to me. "You came here on a mission, so did I, in a way. I read that an old friend of mine was going to be in Florence for a Renaissance music festival. He plays the mandolin. And suddenly I wanted to see him again. Not to be with him, goodness, he has a wife and family, but I thought how funny it would be if we just happened to run into each other." I could not have imagined so much disclosure in a single outburst. I couldn't even understand her motivation. Funny? The impulsiveness of my fellow Americans is often mysterious to me, but I listened with admiration. We'd never met, and we were on a bus in Tuscany, but she was spilling her secrets. Or did she consider me a harmless sounding post? Or did she have no secrets? And then I wondered, had she, like me, been pried open by some recent experience? Perhaps our normal defenses had been weakened. "Maybe you had a wake-up call," I said. "The things we do that elude all reason because suddenly we have to do them." She seemed to ponder the possibility, then consigned it to a secret space for future negotiation. After a few moments, she asked, "Where are you from?" Always an ambiguous question. Where are you really from? India? Am I from Kolkata? California? Bay Area? She said, "I work in a library in a small town in Massachusetts, 2 blocks from Emily Dickinson's house." She'd been married, but not to her mandolinist. She'd gone to New York to dance. She married, but she'd injured herself and turned to painting, and then she'd divorced and started writing. By her estimation, she was a minor, but not failed writer. Like most Bangla speakers of my generation, I've known a number of poets and writers, although most were employed in more mundane endeavors by day. I had never considered them minor or failed. And then her narrative or her confession stopped, and I felt strangely bereft. I sensed she was waiting for me to reciprocate. What did I have to match her? "Are you married?" she asked. I began to understand that something thicker was in the air. "Why do you ask?" "You have an appealing air," she said. It is my experience in the West that Indian men afraid to press their opinions or exert their presence are often perceived as soulful. Many's the time I've wanted to say to very well-meaning ladies, just because I have long, delicate fingers and large, deep brown eyes and a mop of black, unruly hair, do not ascribe to me greater sensitivity, sensuality, or innocence, or some kind of unthreatening pre-feminist manliness. Our attempts to accommodate a new culture are often interpreted as clumsy, if forgivable. I think my uncle and his painter friend enjoyed such a relationship based on mutual misreading. But in his case, all of the cliches might have been true. He was truly an innocent. Unlike him, I have no trouble saying fuck in mixed company. "Do you have children?" she persisted. "I have a girl and a boy who stay with their mother and her parents in San Diego. In my world, the love of one's family is the only measure of success, and in that aspect I have failed." I said only yes. "I'm sorry," she said. "It's none of my business." My uncle was an afflicted man. He never married. His income paid for the education of all the boys in the family and the dowries of all the girls. In a place where family means everything, and if part of the family is pure evil, even one's house can be a prison. Literally a prison. He lived in a back bedroom, afraid even to be seen from the street. He was forced to pay his grandniece's husband 10,000 rupees a month on the threat of his turning over certain documents to the CBI that would prove something. You ask why he didn't protect himself, why he didn't sue, why his passivity was allowed to confirm the most heinous charges, and I say, Indian justice is too slow and corrupt. Cases linger before judges awaiting their bribes. Cases go on as lawyers change sides, as they win stay after stay. That grim prison was the house of my fondest memories, the big family compound on Rashbihari Avenue that our family began renting the moment of their arrival from the eastern provinces, now known as Bangladesh. Our neighborhood was an East Bengal enclave. We grew up still speaking the Eastern dialect. We thought of ourselves as refugees, even the generation like my grandparents, which had arrived before partition. In soccer, we still supported East Bengal against the more established Calcutta team Mohun Bagan. It's the most spirited competition in all of sports, perhaps in the world. 6 years ago, I arrived for my annual visit, this time with $250,000 in year-end bonus money. It was the dot-com era nearing its end, although we thought it would go on forever, and I had been a partner in a startup. When my uncle spilled out his story, and I could see the evidence all around me, I also had the solution in my pocket. I acted without thinking. No courts, no police, no unseemly newspaper coverage that would tarnish the family name. I simply bought the house and kicked the vermin out. But I had forgotten that my wife had a use for that money, a school she'd planned to start. I came back from Calcutta with my uncle in tow. She and the children left for San Diego a week later. She slept on the long ride to Pisa. She slept like a child, no deep breathing, no snoring. I wish she had turned her head towards me. I would have held her, even embraced her. It was the first time in years that I had felt such a surge of protectiveness. There's very little good I can say about Pisa. I'm of two minds about the Leaning Tower. It is iconic, but ugly. It's a monument of phenomenal incompetence. And now the world is invested in a medieval mistake. Actually, I'm not of two minds. It is an abomination. Preserving the mistake is a crime against the great Italian tradition of engineering. In the wide lawns around the tower, various bands of young tourists, mostly Japanese, posed with their arms outstretched, aligning them for photos in a way to suggest they were holding up the crippled tower. We walked towards the tower past stalls of souvenir sellers, most of them, if not all, Bangladeshi, hawking Leaning Tower T-shirts and kitchen towels. They called out to us in English, but I could hear them muttering among themselves in Bangla. It's an older bunch, put out the fancy stuff. I stopped by, drawn in by the language. We may be one of the pioneering languages of Silicon Valley, but we're also the language of the night, the cooks and dishwashers and hole-in-the-wall restaurants and cheap clothing stalls around the world. Then they studied me a little closer. "Hey, brother," this came in Bangla. "Something nice for your girlfriend?" They held up white T-shirts, stamped with the Leaning Tower. "What kind of gift is that?" I answered back. She'd have to lean like a cripple to make it straight. They invited me behind the stalls. Rose came closer but stayed on the edge of the sidewalk. I felt a little guilty. This was my call from the unconscious, the language hook. I remembered my uncle who had bought his devotional tapes to California, and many evenings I would return from work and the lights would be off and he would be singing to his Hemanta Mukherjee tapes and I would keep the lights off and brew tea in the dark. Behind the display bins, the men had stored trunks and trunks of trinkets and T-shirts and towels and tunics, nearly all of them Pisa-related. On each trunk in Bangla, they had chalked the names of cities: Pisa, Florence, Rome, Venice, Pompeii. The three stall owners were cousins. They introduced themselves, Wahid, Hesham, and Ali, cousins from a village a kilometer from my grandparents' birthplace. They knew the town well, and the big house that had been ours, the Zamindari house, the Hindu's house. Maybe their grandfathers as small children had worked there, or maybe they had just stolen bananas from our plantation. "Then you're from the Ganguly family," they asked me, and I nodded, bowing slightly. Abhishek Ganguly, Hindu, even Brahmin, opposite sides of a 1-kilometer world. The buried collective memory forever astonishes. Nothing in the old country could have brought our families together, yet here we are in the shadow of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, remembering the lakes and rivers, the banana plantation, my great-grandfather's throwing open his house on every Hindu and Muslim feast day. In the olden days, in the golden east of Bengal, where all our poetry originated, the Hindus had the wealth, the Muslims had the numbers, and both were united against the British. My ancestral residence, which I've never seen, after partition my parents even tore up old photos they'd carried with them, I learned is now a school. The banana plantation is now a soccer field and cricket pitch. Wahid, Hesham, and Ali, and 3 remoter cousins, what we call cousin brothers, which covers any degree of relatedness, including husbands of cousin sisters, have a lorry, and when the tourist season is over in Pisa, they will strike their stalls and go to Florence and sell Statue of David kitsch, or to Venice and sell gondola kitsch. In the winter, they will go to southern Spain and sell Alhambra kitsch. But think of the distance these cheap but still overpriced T-shirts have traveled. Uzbek cotton spun in Cambodia, stamped in China, and sent to a middleman somewhere in the Emirates to be distributed throughout Europe, matching the proper Western icon to the right city and the proper prepaid sellers. For 1 month, they will return to Bangladesh, bringing gifts to their children and parents, and doubtless enlarging their families. The cousins had come to Italy 4 years ago, starting out by spreading blankets on the footpaths and selling China-made toys. Now they have transportable stalls, and in a couple of years, the 6 cousins will pool their money and buy a proper store somewhere and bring their wives and children over. Right now, they send half of their earnings back to their village, where the wives have built solid houses and the children are going to English medium schools and want to become doctors and teachers. Their wives have opened up tea stalls and stitching shops. "We're Bengalis first, then Hindu or Muslim after," said Wahid, perhaps for my benefit. "If anyone says he is first a Muslim or a Hindu, I give him wide berth. He has right to his beliefs, but I do not share them." All of this I translated for my girlfriend, Rose. Then we sat at a sidewalk cafe and drank a glass of white wine, looking out on the tower and the ant-sized climbers working their way up the sides, waving from the balconies. I was happy. "I think you're a little too harsh on the tower," she said. We reached Florence in the dark. There seemed little question that we would spend the night together, in her hotel or mine. Outside the bus park, only one food stall was still open. I bought apples and a bottle of wine. The young man running it did all his calculations in Italian until I stopped him in Bangla. "That's a lot of taka, isn't it?" And the effect was of a puppet master jerking a doll's strings. He mentioned the name of his village, this one far, far in the east, near Chittagong, practically in Burma. His accent was difficult for me, as mine was to him. "Bangla is the international language of struggle," he said. The unexpected immersion in Bengal had restored a certain confidence. It was the last thing, or the second last thing, I had expected from a trip into the wilds of Tuscany. I was swinging the plastic sack of wine and apples with the urn tucked under my arm, and Rose said, "Let me take the urn." I lifted my arm slightly, and she reached in. "Oops," she said. My religion holds that the body is sheddable, but the soul is eternal. My uncle's soul still exists despite the cremation. It has time to find a new home, entering through the soft spot in a newborn skull. I felt he was still with me there in Italy, but perhaps he'd remained back in California. The soul is in the ether like a particle in the quanta. It can be in California 1 second and Calcutta the next. But he'd wanted to find an Italian home, and now his matter lay in a dusty, somewhat oily mass on the cobblestones of Florence, amid shards of glass and ceramic. It will soon join some sort of Italian flux. It'll be picked up on the soles of shoes. It will flow in the gutter. It'll be devoured by flies and picked over by pigeons. If I'm truly a believer in our ancient traditions, then it doesn't matter where he lies, like a clot of mud, while his soul still circles, awaiting its new house, wherever that house might be. "It's all right," I said. In fact, a burden had been lifted. Her hotel was near at hand. This was an event I had not planned. It had been 3 years since any sexual activity, and that had been brief and not consoling. In the slow-rising elevator, she squeezed my hand. Sex with a gray-haired lady, however slim and girlish, lay outside my fantasy. How to behave? What is the etiquette? She had taken off her glasses, and she was humming something wordless. Under the University of Frenzy sweatshirt, I could make out only the faintest mounds, the slightest crease. Even in the elevator's harsh fluorescent light, I saw no wrinkles in her face. As we walked down the corridor, she slipped me her key card. My fingers were trembling. It took 3 stabs to open the door. The moment the door was shut and a light turned on, she walked to the foot of the bed and turned to face me. The bedspread was a bright, passionate red. It was an eternal moment, the woman's smile, her hands closing around the ends of her sweatshirt and then beginning to pull it up. I dropped the bag of wine and apples. "So this is how it plays. This is how people like us do it." Her head disappeared briefly under the sweater, and then she tossed the University of Firenze aside on the red bedspread, and she stood before me, a thin woman with small breasts, no bra, and what appeared to be a pink string looped against her side. "Now you know," she said, and began kissing me madly. "Come to my bed of crimson joy." What I knew was this: she was bald. Her wig had been caught in the sleeve of her sweater. The pink string was a fresh scar down her rib cage, then curling up between her breasts. But we were on the bed, and my hands were over her scalp, then on her breasts, and the buttons of her jeans, and her fingers were on my belt and pants. There is much to respect in this surrender to passion. After sex, there is humor and honesty. I poured the wine, and she returned to the bathroom, only to reappear in her red Shirley MacLaine wig. With her obviously unnatural burgundy-colored hair, there's a flash of sauciness atop her comely face and body. And so passion arose again. "I've got more," she said. There was a black Liza Minnelli and a blonde. When we sipped the wine, she told me she'd been given a year, maybe 2. But who knows? In this world, miracles have been known to happen. It is overwhelming, the first vision of the David standing a ghostly white at the end of a long, sculpture-lined hall. An adoring crowd surrounds him, whatever the hour of the day. Viewed from afar, in profile, he is a haughty, even arrogant figure. His head is turned. He is staring at his immediate enemy, Goliath. "That pose is called contrapposto," Rose whispered. She was wearing her red Shirley MacLaine wig, and she looked slightly wicked, like a slightly wicked college woman. David's weight is supported on the right leg. The left leg is slightly raised, but the right arm is lank, and curled hand cradles a smooth stone. The left arm is bent, the biceps bunched. The leather sling lies on his shoulder and slithers down his back. Yet when I stood at his side, looking up directly into his eyes, the haughtiness disappeared. I read doubt, maybe fear. It's as though Michelangelo were looking into David's future, beyond the immediate victory. If I remember my Christian schooling, David would go on to become a great king and poet, the founder of a dynasty leading eventually to Christ. But he will lose his beloved son Absalom in a popular uprising against him, and he will send a loyal general to his death in order to possess his wife. In the end, for all his heroism, he will grow corrupt in his pride and arrogance. His is a tattered regime. All of this I felt at that moment and tried to communicate. There is so much tragedy in his eyes. He knows he will accomplish this one great thing in the next few minutes, but regret will flow for the rest of his life. David is a monument to physical perfection, the antidote to the Leaning Tower. And what about us, I wonder? She took my arm as we walked down the swarming sidewalk outside the Accademia. We passed through a great open square near the Uffizi Palace. Crews were setting up folding chairs for an evening concert of Renaissance music. "Will you come with me?" she asked. Of course I would. I would see her mandolinist. We would get there early and sit in the front row. I would stand behind her after the concert, assuming she could make her way to the stage against the press of admirers, and she would ask him, "Remember me?" Maybe she would wear her gray ponytail wig. He would be more comfortable with that, more likely to remember her. In some way I would learn more about her. "Oh, Rose," he might exclaim, or he might dismiss her with a flick of his fingers. "If I'm still above ground next year, and if I come to your house, would you welcome me in?" And I can only say, I will open the door. Thank you.